Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for this event, Reimagining the Federal Government. This is the latest installment of Equitable Growth Presents, Evidence for a Stronger Economy, a lecture series that seeks to foster a deeper understanding of cutting-edge research and analysis on economic inequality and growth. These lectures bring together leading scholars and practitioners to explore how new research is shifting important conversations in academia and economic policy. I'm Corinne Davis, Director of Academic Programs. I apologize that Shana Strom, President and CEO, is unfortunately and unexpectedly unable to join us today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Equitable Growth, we're a research and grant-making organization dedicated to advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies that support strong, stable, and broadly shared growth. As Director of Academic Programs, I oversee our grant-making and also the programming that supports our academic network to engage beyond academia. That's a key reason we're holding this event and why I'm so excited about today's conversation. Research and the scholars producing it are essential inputs into federal policymaking. The current dismantling of the federal government isn't just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to a strong and stable economy. From the National Labor Relations Board and the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, the bulwarks protecting workers and advancing their interests, to independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve, whose mandates are essential to governing the economic commons, to the federal statistical agencies who produce the data on which so many economic decisions are made. Our federal institutions are home to deep technical expertise, committed civil servants, and are essential to a government that, in its ideal, serves all Americans. Yet we are witnessing a dismantling of these institutions, whether it's threats to institutional independence, mass layoffs, budget cuts, or the cancellation of data collection and release. The federal government is being transformed so utterly that it will never look as it did just 11 months ago. But another reason I'm excited for today's conversation is that it's optimistic. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has to take a deep breath before taking in the day's news, but hopefully this won't be that kind of conversation. Yes, we will acknowledge and address the destruction, the harm, the threats, but we'll also focus on the opportunity. The fact is, the federal government hasn't been delivering for the American people in recent decades. Election after election has been about change. Trust in government has been falling for decades. Inequality continues to worsen. Anti-elite authoritarian populism has been on the rise. As we'll hear more about in just a minute, structural designs and layers of bureaucracy systematically favor vested interest over workers and consumers, and often make it difficult for government to quickly and effectively address Americans' needs, whether those are affordable healthcare or housing, reliable infrastructure, or the government's ability to take on threats like climate change, or balance the potential costs and benefits of emerging technology like AI. We need a 21st century government, one that is responsive, nimble, grounded in our democratic ideals, and one that can adeptly take advantage of technical and issue area expertise to guide policy solutions. Equitable Growth has long been building bridges between academics and policymakers and has been organizing scholars who are driven to shape policy outcomes based on their research. We've been building movement infrastructure for scholars to engage in the policymaking process through investments in policy-relevant research, trainings to scholars to speak to policymakers in the press, and networking opportunities to strengthen the feedback loop between policy and research. Part of this includes creating pathways for social scientists to engage in public service. Historically, we've supported scholars to explore opportunities to serve in non-career roles, such as political appointments. Rebuilding federal capacity will take creativity and people power, and we're eager to support this work by facilitating connections. As we'll hear today, there's an emerging ecosystem of groups, some on the front lines defending democracy and fighting for the rights of public servants, others doing the hopeful work of reimagining federal government, and others the detailed work of laying out blueprints for specific agencies or policy areas. We're excited to be partnering with and supporting groups like the Roosevelt Institute and Civil Service Strong and the ad hoc groups of academics and thinkers dedicated to the idea that government is a force for good and that we need to hold it to the highest standards to reach the country's economic, social, and democratic promise. You can't see each other right now, but I can assure you that our audience brings a wealth of knowledge and a diversity of perspectives. I encourage you to participate in the question and answer portion, and I look forward to your thoughts. We'll be dropping links to resources periodically in the chat, and you're welcome to share thoughts or links there as well. Throughout the discussion, we'll be compiling attendee questions for our speakers. Please submit those using the Q&A box. When asking a question, we'd appreciate it if you'd give your first and last name along with your organizational affiliation. If you encounter a technical issue, send a direct message using the chat to EG Events. Please note that this event is being recorded and is on the record. Feel free to post on social media using the hashtag EGPresents. In just a second, I'll introduce our presenter, Sabeel Rahman, but first, a quick overview of the agenda. Following Sabeel's presentation, my colleague Christian Edlogin, Associate Director of Academic Programs, will introduce our panelists, Zach Lisko and Kylie Ross. Christian will then facilitate panel discussion among all three of the speakers. Following that, we expect to have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. And now I'm excited to introduce Sabeel. Sabeel is a professor of law at Cornell Law School, whose research focuses on issues of democracy, governance, economic power, racial equity, and inequality. From 2021 to 2023, he served in the Biden-Harris administration, where he led the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. In that role, he oversaw the policy review and approval of all significant federal regulations. From 2018 to 2021, he served as president of DEMOS, a national racial justice think tank and advocacy organization. He also co-founded the Law and Political Economy Project. Sabeel received his PhD in political theory from Harvard and a master's in economics and socio-legal studies from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Thanks for joining us today, Sabeel, and over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Corinne and Christian and Shayna and the Equitable Growth team for having me. I'm excited to see all these folks on the call, including a number of friends who I recognize, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation too with Kylie and Zach, who have been colleagues across the years in different capacities, and including now. So this is a great space. We appreciate it a ton. I think for me, for purposes of this part of the talk, what I'll try to do is do a little bit of mapping and stage setting of what this moment means for the evolving nature, transforming nature of the administrative state, and the kind of agenda I think that calls all of us, researchers, scholars, advocates, practitioners of different kinds, to be rolling up our sleeves on for these next couple of years. And the punchline for me is that I think there's so much that is urgent and threatening and dangerous in this moment, and many of us are tracking all of those things. And at the same time, I think increasingly what we need is really a different field that is oriented towards rebuilding, reimagining, reconstructing. And that's going to require a bunch of different disciplines and tools and a lot of creativity. So let me first start by setting out a little bit of what I think is happening to the very nature of government in this moment. And then I'll take us from there into what the work ahead might look like. The first thing is, I think it's easy to think about this current moment as we often use a shorthand of democratic backsliding, potential authoritarian or autocratic moment of rupture or breakthrough. But increasingly, I think of what's happening under this in this administration as a kind of reactionary ascendance. And by that, what I mean is it's not just about the familiar tropes of deregulation, right? Kind of to Corinne's framing a moment ago, I think what we're seeing is actually a combination of three distinct transformations of the administrative state. The first is a project of dismantling, right? That is everything from the legislative cuts to safety net programs like SNAP, attempts to undo and unwind through arguably unlawful administrative actions, investments in clean energy, for example. There's a whole host of attempts to shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, mass firing of civil servants. There's a whole set of things we can point to that really has the purpose of trying to dismantle specific administrative capacities that we would really need in a democratic society to deal with issues like inequality and climate change and civil rights and racial injustice and the like. There's a second project at the same time that is what I think of as a weaponizing enterprise, right? So that's not about the dismantling. That's, if anything, the opposite. It's about the supercharging of existing state coercive capacities. So think the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, putting pressure on ABC over broadcasts that it deems critical of the regime, or the weaponization of the Department of Justice and other enforcement capacities by the state. The building of a mass surveillance enterprise that the Department of Government Efficiency, so-called Department of Government Efficiency, tried to build in its first few months. These are excesses of power. So it's not the dismantling of power, but their excess and their weaponizing. And then the last piece of what's going on is really a personalization of power, particularly in the office of the presidency, but increasingly sort of what is one result of the breaking through of norms and restrictions and checks and balances internal to the administrative state is a government that makes decisions arbitrarily on the basis of individual whim of a particular leader. Even down to, I think yesterday there were some headlines, for example, about a proposed program to repurpose some of the unilaterally imposed tariff revenue to then also create a kind of bailout fund for farmers who have been hit by the tariffs. That's all personalized in the singular office of the president, which is not, constitutional law professor in me has to say, that is not how a separation of powers government is supposed to work. So we're seeing dismantling, weaponizing, and personalizing happening all at the same time. All of this is acute in this current moment, but in a lot of ways, they build on prior incrustations and limitations and tendencies in our administrative structures, right? We've had an incapacity problem for a long time, right? Government has been hobbled by hostile judicial doctrine, by limited resources, by out-of-date systems in its ability to move with speed and scale to deal with some of the pressing economic policy issues of the day. The weaponizing also has its antecedent, right? We've had a kind of bipartisan consensus for a number of years around expansive state powers, say on immigration or on surveillance and collection of data. And even the personalizing has its prior versions too. The rise of the unitary executive theory has been, of course, lands very different. It has very different flavor now, but pre-January, you would find adherents of that approach on left and right, on both sides of the bench, on the Supreme Court. So there's a longer history to each of these transformations as well. Going forward, then, to me, what that says is that for those of us who are interested, committed to the idea that you need a public serving government to address pressing public problems, it poses, this diagnosis, I think, poses a number of major design questions, challenges, mandates for all of us who care about this. And that is we can break it down, I think, into three complementary pieces, right? I think one is the building of new affirmative capacities, imagining governance structures that are fit for purpose in the modern era. What would we actually need to deal with the kinds of economic inequality and precarity that we see now? What would we actually need to deal with the climate crisis that is worsening, particularly given the policy reversals? These are real questions that will require affirmative state capacities to be imagined in a different way. The second project is a dismantling and a containment project on the authoritarian side, right? How do we rein in and dismantle autocratic capacities that have no business being part of a democratic government or society going forward? And the third is, I think of as a democratizing enterprise. If a central premise of our constitutional system is we don't live in a monarchy, we ought not be governed by a singular will, then I think there are broader questions about, well, what does that mean about the nature of the presidency writ large? How do we think about the balance between public participation and policymaking at speed and scale in ways that create meaningful democracy, but also allow for efficacious, effective governance on matters of major concern. So this is, I think, a broader set of agenda items. What I want to pivot to now is just give a couple of examples to concretize what this might look like. And here I think there's actually been an enormous amount of really important work that scholars, practitioners, advocates have been doing over many years to spotlight issues, imagine alternatives, and if anything, I think we want to double or triple down on that orientation and try to go even bigger in this next phase. So let me give a couple of examples. One is thinking about the kinds of the changing nature of economic power and corporate power and what that might mean for governance. So if you think back to the 2008 financial crisis, for example, one of the big ways that scholarship played an enormously important role was a host of economists, legal scholars, and others who were really deep in the weeds to diagnose what was this thing that was shadow banking and credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities that emerged. How did that generate systemic risk? And what are the policy tools that might be needed to respond to that new form, kind of in some ways familiar to pre-New Deal hyper-financialization, but very distinct and modern to that moment. That took a lot of work to diagnose and unpack, but then to start to imagine what regulatory tools might be needed. Not all of those tools got built in the end, and we can talk more about that. But I think it's a good example of the kind of enterprise that we would need now, whether it's kind of new forms of tech oligarchy and control. We're seeing the massive concentration of corporate power over, say, media ownership or in the market economy. There are all kinds of ways in which economic power is concentrating in new ways that is going to require very sophisticated analysis and diagnosis that can then inform what kinds of new regulatory enforcement tools, rulemakings, even agency structures, right? Do we need to create a whole new configuration of economic regulatory agencies? These are design questions that are the kind that I would imagine us all kind of linking arms to try to solve together. Let me give a second example on the deconstruction side. I mentioned a little bit about Doge, and we're all, I think many of us, tracking the kind of videos online of, masked, unmarked people grabbing Americans off the street and packing them into unmarked cars. But this is the kind of bread and butter stuff of autocratic governance that really should have no place in a democratic society. But that raises all kinds of design questions, right? What are the technological as well as legal institutional redesign approaches to undo the building of a mass surveillance apparatus that allows real-time tracking of targets of interest, for when ICE agents are roaming around the streets of Chicago, for example, or the restructuring of immigration enforcement authorities in the first place, right? I think it's easy for many people to forget that the Department of Homeland Security itself was a creation of a major agency reorganization after 9/11, just over 20 years ago. And so what might be different reconfigurations of agency authority that we might need to imagine in this next phase of building an administrative state? A third example we might think of is on the participation side, and I think this is something I imagine we'll get into with Kylie and Zag. I know both of them are thinking about these questions in really interesting and important ways. But I think there are very real questions about how would one design an approach to governing that restores trust and meaningfully engages with the most impacted constituencies, right? People who often see government as distant, a black box, far away from their lived experience, or increasingly, hostile to their lived experience, right? That's a real problem in a democracy, and we need to think about ways to engage people to re-legitimize and reanimate public-spirited governance. But there are real questions about how do we do that in a way that is efficacious, right? And I think there are lots of ways to answer that question, but it is a design question, right? What form of engagement, at what point in the policymaking process, how do you staff that kind of engagement? How do you design it? Right? These are questions that will require some building off of experience and experiment, which we can point to at the state and local level. And then one last set of questions, just because I can't resist as a constitutional law person, is I do think this is going to all require us to bring a kind of fresh argument for kind of small d democratic government at the highest level, which is to say, I think our public politics has gotten very accustomed to a personalistic and presidentialist form of politics, right? We think of singular leaders who are going to come and save us all with their great ideas, but that's not really how we ought to work, right? I think we want to imagine what's a different bounds of power around the presidency itself. How do we reanimate legislative authority? How do we rein in judicial overreach, right? A lot of these reactionary forms of power have been authorized and blessed by a Supreme Court, and that raises a whole set of other design challenges as well for folks who are interested in those types of questions. So this is a lot to do and a lot to cover. Let me close out my part of the talk with maybe just a short word about how we get from here to there. And I think each of us will have different views on what the theory of change is. How do we get from this moment of crisis to a moment of real transformation? I think for me, a lot of what I draw inspiration from is thinking about these past historical moments of major democratizing change that came out of really deep experiences of crisis, right? So, of course, you have the Reconstruction Amendments coming out of the Civil War, which create for the first time, at least on paper, right? The aspiration for a multiracial, inclusive democracy. But then think about the early 20th century, the deep dislocation and suffering experienced by the chaos of industrialization and the way in which that forced a really rich ferment of social movements, policymakers, and advocates testing out new approaches to governing at the state, local, and then eventually federal level, right? This is when you start to see the creation of municipal utilities, the creation of antitrust authorities, the creation of the modern safety net in various forms, the modern civil service in various forms. And those experiments then sort of animate federal transformations when the New Deal comes in or when you have these big moments of possibility. And so I think there's a way in which, as challenging and dangerous as this moment is, it's sort of on us to build towards a moment where a transformation might happen and to have at the ready some of the ideas and analysis and scholarship, right, that can be brought to bear in a moment like that. So let me pause there and turn it over to Christian, and I'm sure we can unpack all of this more in our panel.
You're muted.
Awesome. Well, first I said thank you, Sabeel. Sorry about that. My name is Christian Edlogin. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Programs at Equitable Growth, and I am thrilled and grateful to have this conversation with some amazing policy and governance experts joining us. It's bittersweet because I'm swapping in for Shayna, who had served in government and in various roles worked closely with scholars to shape policy and just has a ton of insights to share, and I know she wishes she could be here with us all. I, on the other hand, have not served in government, but rather I've been working with equitable growth for much of the past decade, helping scholars elevate their research findings for policymakers. So, like many of the folks attending, I'm very excited to learn more about these current efforts to rebuild US democracy and the federal government and some of the concrete ways for social scientists to get involved, help us chart a way forward through all this chaos and uncertainty. So, joining Sabeel on this panel will be Zach Liskow, professor of law at Yale Law School. During the Biden administration, he was a chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget. And under Obama, he was a staff economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Zach's work currently covers tax policy, benefit cost analysis, and infrastructure costs. Welcome, Zach. We'll also be joined by Kylie Russ, the director of Democracy Works. Hi, Kylie. Democracy Works 250 with Democracy Forward. She previously served in the Office of Personnel Management as a senior advisor on hiring reform and innovation. And prior to her public service, she co-founded Govern for America, a nonprofit created to build the next generation of public servants. Kylie brings a wealth of experience in talent innovation at the federal and state levels, talent pipeline cultivation, and collaboration across sectors. Now, I have approximately 25 or 30 minutes for the panel, and I have a number of questions to get us started. And while I haven't been in government, I have run a countless number of events and workshops. So I plan on being a friendly but firm timekeeper here, and also because I'm really excited to turn to the audience for their questions. So if you're watching, please start thinking about what you want to ask our esteemed panel. So let's kick things off. And I'll start with you, Zach. So you served in previous administrations and have been involved in conversations recently about state capacity and the abundance agenda. Can you describe for the audience what those things mean or don't mean, and how those might inform your thinking on how the rebuild and reimagining of government should work?
Yeah, delighted to be here. So state capacity and abundance I view as kind of overlapping agendas. Abundance being about the desire to build and invent more of what we need, with the goals that Sabeel described, as well as increasing economic growth. State capacity is about increasing the ability of the government to do well what it tries to do. That can involve hiring more and better people. It can involve the government cutting rules on itself, but one way or another, it's about government effectiveness. So with respect to abundance, which state capacity you could view as one part of, perhaps, I think they're kind of high level two things that you'd want to have more abundant infrastructure and energy and housing and healthcare, et cetera. The first is that the government often has too much procedure, too many rules, especially on itself, which limits the ability to get good things done. And second, that the government often just lacks the resources, especially in personnel, to be effective at what it's trying to do. And I think importantly, both of these kind of long predate Trump. These are decades in the making. Often, if you believe certain narratives, that they are making of liberals in the 1960s and 1970s, well-meaning liberals in the 1960s and 70s. So I think that to a large extent, Trump provides an opportunity because like there will have to be rebuilding, but it's not like suddenly we need to change to fix things because things have I think arguably been broken for a while, and this is I won't speak for others, but I think this is what I experienced in government, and I think many others did as well. Kind of things working kind of astonishingly slow, and if you read the news at all, there are many failures of the Biden administration that I think are easily linked to kind of excessive process. So and lack of state capacity. So I work mostly on transportation infrastructure. Why it takes a long time to build, why it's costly to build. Just let me illustrate each of those two things. First, proceduralism, and second, kind of lacking capacity. So first, on procedure, if you look over time at building the U.S. interstate highways, the cost to build them like tripled between the 1960s and the 1980s. And like it's not 100% clear what happened between the 1960s and the 1980s, but I think best guess, and I could provide various pieces of evidence, is that what happens is we pass a bunch of laws. And it required that the highways were built in ways that were much, much more expensive. Much of that was good because in the 1960s, we were bulldozing neighborhoods without consultation, often targeting low-income minority areas. But it's questionable whether we needed them to actually triple in costs. And the highways got wigglier. We often built, one example I like pointing to, we built parks on top of highways in suburban areas next to fields, which is, I think, a questionable expense because that was the only way to get the project to go forward because the people were suing under new statutes created in the early 1970s. So just a lot of litigation, as well as a lot of new rules on procuring things that didn't exist beforehand, motivated by reducing corruption, but create a lot of new rules that could easily have increased costs. So that's proceduralism. Second, on resources, I'm working on a project now on the California Department of Transportation. Again, building highways, not because I particularly care about highways, but that's most of what we spend money on in transportation, and that's where the money is, and that's where the data are at. So if you care about government effectiveness, you should care about how cost effective we are building highways, how cost effectively we're building highways. So I've looked at the personnel, the engineers who sit in government and manage the highway building process. And we found some very striking results. We found that if you go from the 25th to 75th percentile of quality of these government engineers, the cost savings that result from increasing quality would pay for 3x the cost of the average engineer. So quality really, really, really pays for itself. And you could see like reforms coming out of like maybe we should pay more, maybe we should promote more based on quality, maybe we should make it easier to hire, but quality really seems to pay for itself. Furthermore, it really appears that quantity, especially of experienced engineers, really pays for itself. In a year where an extra 1% of these experienced engineers retire, costs go up by so much that those engineers, including the retirement benefits, would have paid for themselves 6 times over. And what's going on here is that these engineers who work in government, they do a huge amount. They're like a very small number of people managing just many, many millions of dollars of projects. So like one one civil servant can actually have a really, really big impact because of how few people there are in government managing such big projects. And it's really complicated what government does. Taking the example of building infrastructure, you need to design the project. That can be done well or poorly. You need to put it out for bids. That can be done well or poorly. You can need to design the bid documents. That can be done well and poorly. And then you need to manage the contractor. And that can be done well or poorly. Each of those things, you can have lower costs or higher costs. So then when you put those two things together, stepping back, fewer procedures, especially on itself, not that there are not going to be trade-offs. And second, increasing the quality and quantity of personnel in government, I think will help us rebuild and achieve a government that delivers.
Got it. That's great. And so clearly there are lessons to learn from past governing challenges on procedure and personnel, including at the state level. And there are different strategies to get to some of the same goals that Sabeel outlined. I think we're going to turn back to that because you alluded to this idea of potential trade-offs. But let me turn to Kylie, and I'm hoping you can talk about your work with Democracy Forward and Civil Service Strong. And from your perspective, what does success in reimagining government look like in the next 2 years, by the 2020 election, or even a decade from now?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here, Kylie, Director of Democracy Works 250, which is the reform arm of Civil Service Strong, which is a project of Democracy Forward. We have a lot of layering here. The Democracy Forward Foundation is a national legal organization that advances democracy and social progress through litigation, policy, public education, and regulatory engagement. Today, I'm here, though, to talk about our most recent effort that we launched about 3 weeks ago that is a coalition building effort that will put together a strategy to completely reimagine civil service policies, talent pipelines, and the systems that really govern whether civil servants can do their jobs effectively. So Democracy Works 250 is really a people-first strategy to rebuild federal government's ability to deliver. And Zach, what you said really resonated with me because the idea here that this whole project is rooted in is that you can't get 21st century modern tech-enabled results with a government that is running on completely outdated systems with undervalued people who've been put in systems and on teams that are not set up for them to deliver. And so I agree completely that over the last 11 months, we have seen more people start to care about this issue, but this is not a new issue. This is an issue that has been piling up, one hiring authority after another for 50 years. It's been 50 years since we've seen any type of meaningful civil service reform. And so we are trying to completely reimagine what the civil service system looks like in government, acknowledging that the last year has pointed out the cracks, but they're not new issues. And so Democracy Works 250 brings together 4 interconnected projects that start with listening, move to policy design, and people and team infrastructure. So the first project is a national listening infrastructure. We are going to be going out across the country, digitally and physically, to gather stories from Americans, to hear from them what they want out of their government, how a government is and isn't effectively showing up in their lives. We will also interview some of the 300,000 civil servants who will have left by the end of this year, to ask them how is government set up ineffectively? What are the changes that are needed from the insider's perspective? The second project will be completely reimagining workforce policy. So we already have a pretty robust coalition of organizations that are thinking about what civil service policy needs to look like in a modern government. And over the next year, we will create a policy library where those ideas can live. The third project is a Future of Government Talent program. This one is like the most like HRE. So in this one, we are completely reimagining what teams across government look like. I agree with what Sabeel and Zach said. I forget which one of you said this before, but we oftentimes are kind of like dropping people in to the system. Um, and they're not set up in a team structure dynamic for them to be successful. And so they run into roadblocks and frustration, even if they're like the most talented person in their field. You can't expect them to get things done if they're not set up in a structure that works. And so we're reimagining what operational teams across government look like. Think the really cool stuff like HR, like tech and AI teams, participatory government teams. So that is the third piece. And the second phase of that project will be to go out and actually find humans that will sit in those seats. And then the fourth project is our civil service defense and innovation fellows, which is a national cohort. So far, we've brought on about 22 fellows who over the next year will assess what's happened to their agencies, tell the story of why that matters to Americans, and then start to think about, well, what does that mean about the workforce that these policy areas need going forward? I'm almost done, I promise. So these are really coming together into a people-centered reform design. And so to skip forward to your question about what success looks like. In the next 2 years, we want to have a broad, diverse coalition, a policy library. We want to know what those redesign teams look like, and we will be working with people across the public sector, but also private sector and international counterparts to think about what those team structures look like. And more. And then in 5 years, we hope that we have a new bench of talent that is operating in government, in teams, and that we have a system that is really set up more equitably and more modern. And in 10 years, our big picture goal here is that Americans will be able to say, I know what the federal government is delivering for me in a positive way. When I go do X, I see that the federal government is showing up for me effectively, and I know where the services are coming from. Um, okay, happy to be here.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad that these efforts that you're describing are centering people. And that's also very much why we're trying to bring in more scholars and academics in our network to this work. So it will be all hands on deck, so to speak. And so both Kylie and Zach and Sabeel, you've talked now about longstanding challenges in government and different ways forward. So I have a question for all of the panelists. What are some other promising models you've seen for reform, or what other lessons should we be heeding from failed reform efforts? And feel free to draw from examples at any level of government, historical ones, or even from abroad.
I'll keep the ball for a second. So there's two that I'll briefly talk about. One is Engaged California is this new really awesome like listening tool that California is using to hear from constituents about how policies are landing with them. I think that that's really promising. It's really early stages, so I think we'll have to see how that plays out. And that's at the state level. At the federal level, something that we were really proud of was that the PACT Act in 2022 was a law that substantially expanded VA healthcare and disability benefits for veterans and survivors that were affected by toxic exposures. And through that process, the thing that I'm really proud of in that process is that the process was really grounded in working directly with veterans and directly with the VA to ask them, what do you need? And then the government operations kind of teams around it came together in a really positive way to actually design the personnel and the delivery mechanisms to make that distribution possible. So that was very much like a people and operations centered effort that started with listening to what was needed, but then actually designed the delivery mechanism to do the thing that people were saying that they needed.
And it sounds like scholars should be studying how well that program worked out and seeing what that could do, what insights we can take from that. Zach, turn it to you.
Yeah, I'll describe two success stories in the context of building stuff. These are both in the kind of government effectiveness agenda. Sabeel brought up the specter of authoritarianism, which is also very important, but which I don't have as much to say about. These are also both at the state and local level, where if you care about government effectiveness, that's actually where overwhelmingly that's where the game is. That's state and local governments do much more than the federal government. If you care about authoritarianism, you need to talk about the federal government, and Sabeel will solve those problems for us in a few minutes. So the two examples that I want to point to are first the green line is the light rail line in Boston. It's one of these classic, just way over budget, way behind schedule projects, and it was just like a disaster waiting to happen if it ever happened at all. And then a new governor came in, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, and turned it around. And the way he did it was he looked at the budget and took things that had gotten way too big, way too convoluted, in part because people in government had kept on saying yes. You can't say yes to everyone. If you say yes to everyone, it'll cost an infinite amount or cost many, many billions of dollars and possibly never get done. So they started saying no. And they shrunk the stations down to simple platforms because you don't need really complex platforms. And on the Green Line in Massachusetts, this is not Manhattan. And they staffed up. Before, there were kind of astonishingly few people managing this billions-dollar project. They paid some of them very well. The head of it, they paid about $500,000 a year, which is very high for a civil servant, but these people can be paid much more than that in the private sector, so to attract them, you often need to pay that much. And it ended up going really well. So it's built, cost much less. That's a case where you didn't need to change statutes. And I think in many cases we will, but that's one where leadership and making hard decisions result in some good outcomes. Second example, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania has done some, I think, very impressive things on permitting. In executive order, day one, said we're going to look across the board at how long it takes the state to permit businesses and infrastructure and everything else. And we're going to see what we can do under existing statutory authority to speed things up. And this speeding up has been dramatic within a couple of years. And that involves some rearrangement of government. It involved having some government effectiveness teams effectively in the governor's office. It involved, I think, make some tough decisions. It involved focus. But in the end, it's cut a lot of red tape and I think been very effective for him. So what I take from this, so I'm a lawyer and an economist. I tend to think that kind of economic fundamentals and laws end up making a huge amount of difference, and they do. I'm sure that's a lot of what happened with those extremely expensive highways in the 70s and 80s. But it's not just that. It's also leadership, and it's making hard choices. And that gives me a little more hope because it can be a lot easier to have an effective leader than to change a bunch of hard laws.
That's a great point. There's a cultural aspect of this as well in decision making. And then Sabeel, if you have thoughts to this question too.
Yeah, just to add to I love these examples, and just to add a few more. I mean, when going back to where Kylie started us off, I mean, I love these models that blend kind of a real rootedness in what actual people in community constituencies on the ground are feeling and thinking and needing, and drawing that into the work of governing ourselves, right? And that's, I think, was through a lot of Kylie's examples. I think I'll add a few more, so that maybe more recent at the federal level. So, a couple of years ago, the Federal Trade Commission issued a major non-compete rule banning non-compete clauses in employment contracts. Now, this rule has since been basically given up, abandoned by the current FTC. But it's a good example to me of using a legal authority that was already there, like in the Sherman Antitrust Act, in the regional authorities of the FTC, to regulate unfair methods of competition, being very empirically rigorous, right? About, there's this thing happening in the world where workers not just kind of high skill, high tech software engineers, but like line cooks at fast food restaurants, right, are being barred from having job mobility, and that's hugely impactful in terms of their employment prospects. It exacerbates a whole host of racial and gender disparities in the economy. And then also they built this through a really deep listening enterprise, right? They spent a lot of time, number of years of hearing from small businesses going across the country, hearing from workers in various industries to build a policy that then like does something big and transformative for the economy. That's, I think, a kind of affirmative state capacity that is also deeply democratic, but also leveraging a lot of expertise, right? What the administrative state is there for, that I think is indicative. It also, I think, Zach said you can't say yes to everybody, and I think I'll echo that, but in a little bit of a different way. Like, I think we should be sort of clear-eyed that like we want to build a more democratic future. And that means there are going to be some interests that don't win out, right? You don't get to make a lot of money by exploiting workers, and you don't get to, rendition people in broad daylight off the streets. And those are just like things that we don't want in our society, right? And that means that we would want to build governing institutions that do more of the things that are normatively just and good and desirable for all of us, and less of the things that are painful, and violating of individual and human rights.
So picking up from that point of not being able to say yes to everybody, there's going to have to be a balance of sorts of interest here. I'm going to turn us back to a point earlier in this conversation. So, Sabeel, you've mentioned again now needing and wanting to increase democratic participation. And we've now talked about sometimes there being potential trade-offs between efforts to include more voices and efforts to speed up government's work, as Zach had talked about briefly. So how do you think about, in the reimagining of government, balancing, these or other, potentially competing or not competing valuable goals? And then Zach, I'd like to ask you a similar question on balancing those things.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I think sometimes when we have these conversations, there's a temptation to see this as an all or nothing enterprise, right? Either we have deep civic engagement and participatory co-governance, or we have government that can move with speed and scale and like to do big things. And I just think that's like a false dichotomy, right? I think to a theme that both Zach and Kylie were talking about, a lot of the ways that we had institutionalized striking this balance were not fit for purpose in the modern era. And so to me, it's a design question. How do you reconfigure it? And so some of the things that I'm especially interested in, Kylie mentioned a number of these great state and local experiments. There's a huge ecology of co-governance, co-design, participatory budgeting, all kinds of really interesting things that state and local governments have been pioneering that I think point to very different models of how you bring people directly in to a policy design process. A big part of what makes that work is that it's really upstream. So it's not like a policy is cooked and then like you get to file a comment or you get to bring a lawsuit to hold up, many years of work. What you're actually doing is you're engaging people upstream and early at a stage where hearing about different priorities, different needs, things that might be missed by the folks initially holding the pen, that can be really influential, but in a way that is highly effective and can be done, and it's not is like sort of part of can be baked into the process without creating a lot of disruption, right? So I think moving more of these engagements upstream would be really important. I think a second thing is that it takes real expertise and craft to do this well. Like you can't just throw open the doors and host a town hall and expect that to go well. Like you need people who who are trained as organizers, who have the kind of user experience expertise that Kylie was mentioning. There's a whole host of skills that I think are very much there among pockets of our great civil service, but so often it is kind of cabined away in a regional office or in a consultation office that is not really connected to the policy leadership, right? And so we have these we're really underperforming on this front between the way all of this has been configured. So I think for me the bottom line is more upstream engagement that is meaningful. And more dedicated resources and capacity to do the engagement work itself, because that takes skill and that takes dedication as well.
Yeah, there are certainly are people, especially abundancy type people, who kind of just don't agree with Sabeel and think that the premise that participation is important is wrong. I'm not one of those people. I think that I like participation. I think we should have actually more of it. And I think that our notions of participation are so I think that the processes of the participation and often just our notions are so warped right now that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can both increase participation and speed things up and make them cost less. So let me take the example of infrastructure. Currently, the notion of participation now often consists of there's a project that's basically planned, and then you submit your comments, which often don't have much impact as part of the environmental review process, and then you sue. And the suing is the participation. And uh, this strikes me as just bizarre. Like small numbers of people suing to stop things that they do not like, when those things, especially when those things, as is often the case, would benefit large numbers of people, it is not participation. That is anti-democratic. That's not to say we should not have courts in these circumstances. It's important to have a rule of law, and courts are important for enforcing that. But uh, that's often just not what happens. Often we have NIMBYs, and they do things that are in their interest, but not in the broader interest. And that is bad. So the thing I would add to Sabeel's emphasis, which I totally agree on the value of early participation, I would say broad participation. I think we need to be soliciting large numbers of opinions. We should not just depend upon the people who are often are richer and older and whiter who show up at meetings. We need to proactively get comments from people, draw them into the process. Uh, so fully on board with that. It needs to be early and meaningful. But I think you need to, on the flip side, to doing more of that in the front end is on the back end, cutting back on the kind of pseudo participation that isn't actually participation, except for a small number of people. And that's where I'd cut back and slow things, because I think that really slows things down and makes things cost much more. That's where you end up with the parks on top of highways in the middle of fields, just to get the project done, costing the public tens of millions of dollars, tripling the cost, whereas that money could have been much better spent on education or Medicaid or a railroad or a huge number of other good things that government does. So listen, there's sometimes some trade-off, but I think that like at some point you have to stop participation. But the idea is you want to have the participation and then decide, and then move on in a democratically legitimate way. And I think for now, given how perverse the place we are that we're starting it is, we can increase participation and release and reduce costs and reduce speed for the things that government needs to do.
I know that this question was not passed to me, but I feel very inclined to just jump in quickly to add
Please
a couple
do.
things. I totally agree early in the process, upstream, but also then closing the loop on the back end so that people can actually see how their participation was used. Because I think a lot of times we just like assume people are going to like, I don't know, go in and read the law, like, I don't know, read the laws or whatever. And that's just not going to happen. So I think we need to be proactively reaching out and being like, this is how your input was used. I also think we should be realistic about how people are going to participate. Let's meet people where they are, which is on social media, which is online, to do legitimate feedback, to ask them how policies are going to show up in their lives and in their communities, and just like lean into being online, which is like one of my last points, which is that technology is going to enable us to do this in such a different way than we've had to do it in the past, which is by physically being in person to ask people for input or to do the like arcane like input on like a specific thing that's already completely baked. And then my last point is that I feel strongly that in the next years, as we are thinking about what the reform is going to look like when we have our next governing moment, we need to be baking in participatory governance to the reform process so that it is like habit and second nature for when we are governing. Like we can't just show up on whenever we get our next governing moment and be like, now we're going to do participatory government. It should be baked in now over the next however many years we're working on this issue.
Fantastic. I like this overarching note of proactively drawing people in and early in the process, which is why we're all here, and also closing the loop with participants. And we promise to be following up with attendees after this event. And I'll echo an earlier point Sabeel made, kind of echoing Kylie's emphasis on public servants playing a critical role in helping us prioritize different goals with expertise and institutional knowledge. And any reform efforts will need to be implemented amid this governance crisis and relying on civil servants who are still in government, who have been through an awful lot, and will surely have more to face in the years to come. So how should we be rethinking about these rebuilding efforts while taking that into consideration, the human aspect of these folks that are continuing to serve in government?
I'll go first again. Okay, so yes, we at Democracy Forward are very clearly and loudly in the defense camp, defending civil servants themselves and a nonpartisan civil service, while also very much acknowledging that that doesn't mean that like the civil service system still need to be completely remade and reimagined. And so any serious effort to rebuild government really has to start with the acknowledgement that there are going to be people who are going to last until whenever it is that we are going to be able to rebuild and reimagine, and that the people who are going to have lasted will be traumatized intentionally, and they are going to be working in systemically hollowed out, purposefully demoralized, and in a lot of cases, actively attacked systems and people. And so those same people are going to have to be but those people who are still inside are going to have to be the ones who we rely on to start carrying out what these reforms actually look like. So we know that like the way that we are thinking about this, we know there will be the existing people. We also know that we're going to have to bring in completely different people with completely different mindsets, completely different skill sets. And so the merging of those two worlds is going to be tricky. And there will be people who have been in the civil service for decades. And that will certainly be a culture clash. And so we are very much thinking about this as a defense of the people and also reform, because we think that we're going to have to treat the people who are inside as partners in this effort, not just implement this thing that I'm handing you. And so we are really trying actively to like earn trust and really actively trying to tell people that we have their best interests at heart. And one of those interests is to redesign the system so that they can actually do their best work. And so we're very much in the like earning trust part of the journey, and we will try to see how we can actually invite civil servants into the process of redesign while acknowledging that it may have to be the people who are leaving civil service to be in the redesign.
Yeah, just to build on that, I so appreciate that orientation that the Democracy 250 team is taking. And, at least in my experience, there's so much of the heroic work of so many civil servants is in navigating many of these over encrusted, really like difficult processes to get good policy through, right? And because they know the ins and outs, and so like that's a huge service, but also like those person hours could go a lot further, right? If we modernized a lot of these systems and processes that both Kylie and Zach are talking about. So that's one, and then I think too, I think the balancing that Kylie describes is really important in the sense that the principle of an independent civil service that does not turn over every time an administration changes hands because of out of a kind of like pre-Pendleton Act spoils system, right? Like that's not conducive to democratic governance. And so that feels like very clear and urgent and important. And this idea that like the particular structure that we happen to have as of, December 2024, it's like there's nothing platonically perfect about any of that, right? And then maybe last thing, because I see some of the questions coming up. In terms of the new expertises, I think this is something that I'm also really interested in. Is that what would it look like to have the civil service? The government is us, right? And you want a civil service that is looks a lot more like the way the country looks, demographically, but also in terms of lived experience, also in terms of different skill sets that are being brought to bear. I spent a lot of time, as Zach did, thinking through economic analysis of public policy, and I often think, well, what would it look like to have more sociological or ethnographic or lived experience expertises informing a lot of those decisions, because it's just a different kind of expertise. So I think there's real value and opportunity in bringing a different set of people into the kind of civic service that we're talking about.
Quickly add one thing. Totally agree with almost everything Sabeel and Kylie said. I guess I'd look at it as a kind of a three-track approach. One is kind of defending federal workers today. Second is planning for the future and showing that we're going to help make you more effective. But the third that I would add is do it, and do it at the state and local level. So we're still years away from people who actually care about effective government being in government. At the federal government, we now have incoming governors in 2 states who are, for example, very interested in government working effectively. The Recoding America Fund, led by Jim Palka, is going to be doing it. And I think one lesson that I've taken from working in this area is each government's different, and part of what you need to do to solve these things is to get deep in the weeds, and the weeds are gonna be different in different places, but they're also general lessons, and I think that showing that these kinds of reforms can make civil servants do their jobs more effectively, kind of enable them, empower them, is something that I think could both provide good ideas and also kind of ease these types of changes in with the workforce in 2029.
Totally agree. We got to start finding ways to start doing this work. I just have a couple of more questions. So I want to remind folks in the audience to start submitting and to continue submitting your questions to the Q&A. If you have any tech issues, just flag it in the chat and someone will help. Sabeel, you teed us up for this already a little bit. So my question for all the panelists is, how can research and evidence be embedded in reform efforts? And what advice would you have for a social scientist, many of are in this room with us, who are interested in getting involved in reform efforts, and potentially at the state or local level too, to Zach's point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm sure there are, as folks listening, I think in RDC, we've opened up so many different big areas. There's no shortage of things. Maybe to slice into, I'll mention a few different types of work that are particularly front of mind for me. One is that I think all the things we're talking about really depend on a kind of rigorous, but also kind of outside of policy, more kind of scholarly type of analysis of just the existing power dynamics and relationships in society as it's evolving, right? So people who understand what's happening in the financial sector with the emergence of crypto, what is happening to our climate on the ground, and the way in which we're seeing kind of the pullback from environmental enforcement actions. And there are all kinds of things happening where part of it is just the kind of work of diagnosing and unpacking what is going on, what is the data that we can bring to bear on that, and is there a political economy analysis for the political economists on the call about what are the configuration of interest groups that are driving some of these dynamics. All of that is really important background, right, to inform actual substantive policy. I think a different kind of work is the kind of process analysis redesign work that I think all three of us have been talking about, right? So like some of Zach's scholarship on like how the infrastructure stuff actually plays out, some of these civic innovations that Kylie was mentioning, right? There's real research there that might be more sort of attuned to different scholars' orientation that will provide good institutional models, right, for some of the experiments that we're talking about. And then a third one that I'll mention is uh, precisely because there's so much. One of the big threats, of course, is the attack on and dismantling of a federal data infrastructure. So not the weaponizing of data, but what's going to happen to NOAA's weather data and EPA's emissions data, and like all kinds of things we can talk about. But for scholars who are data scientists, who understand how data works, who work with large quantities of data, I think there's going to be an enormous need to be building and tracking and analyzing with a kind of large database approaches all the things that are happening now in different scholars' areas of interest.
I'll just add a couple of things that I think there is opportunity. There is so much work to be done here that I think it fully depends on where folks want to engage in the process, whether it is like the upstream design, like designing, pointing to specific examples of models for participatory government. It could be downstream after we've talked to Americans and civil servants, put together ideas, stress test them, like how would this work? How would this work? Research type questions. I also think that there is like still not a lot of great data sources on what has actually happened and then very specifically and what is the impact on Americans. Like I think that I still have not seen very many compelling this is why it matters pieces, and I think that's hurting us. And I think like if we could come together around examples of why the destruction of the government is bad for America and in a compelling story way, I think that would really help us and would help us reorient the redesign to be also very story forward, which shouldn't matter, but it does. Like we have to be able to say what government is doing in people's lives if we want people to be invested and in government and actually want a functioning federal government. So I think there's just there's many research questions that I think are completely unanswered, and maybe that is because of the data. Partially because of the data glut and the fact that we don't have reliable data sources, and so like helping to piece together what we can from existing sources is going to be very helpful.
The thing that I would add in terms of something that a social scientist who's interested in reform efforts could do is to write a white paper kind of aimed at policymakers, that's accessible to policymakers, that is directed toward reform efforts. My experience in government was included a few things. Number one, you're just really, really, really busy. And like something that's like directed at you, like here's the question I'm asking and here's the answer, like that's just much more likely to get adopted because it's easier to process, and like if it on its face says the thing, it says it's going to say the thing that you want to know, then you're going to more likely to pick it up, more likely to pick it up. Related to that, I was just astonished at the number of things, white paper or not, they're just like really important questions. There was not a paper on. And so like think of the important question and some reform efforts. It may not get you published in the top economics journal or whatnot, but it might be extremely influential. I could think of one thing in particular, like one of the important things I worked on. There was no single good paper on this that was squarely on topic. Had that paper been written, it would have been extremely influential. It's not where we're sending it, but those things will come back. And so, so write that paper. May not be the most effective thing for getting a tenure, but it might be the most impactful thing you can do. And I have every reason to expect that the next Democratic administration will be chock full of people who care about expertise and care about knowledge. But are really busy and are not omniscient, so kind of need the paper on the thing in order to adopt it.
Zach, I love that so much, and I totally agree with you. And something that I've been hearing from lots of people is like, write the paper and tell me what the pros and cons are explicitly of the various programs. And ideally, although this is hard, like what factions of society will support this and which will not. Because when people are then coming into power and decision-making positions, they will want to know, well, the unions will hate this, but this other group will be very supportive. And so like the pros and cons and where in society would support, I think are pieces of information that are really hard to get, but I think are extremely helpful.
I love that too. And you're not alone in this. So, equitable growth is always on the ready to help academics get their research in the right hands, to help translate those findings. And so we welcome all of these ideas. We also have lots of questions that I want to turn to from the audience. And I will start with one from Liz Ford. I'll read it as I see it here is, I can't help but notice no mention at all of the collective bargaining. There are lots of ways to think about the existence of collective bargaining in the public sector, and I would like to understand your perspective on the existence of unions in the public workplace and the implications of workplace unions for both operational effectiveness and democratic governance generally. So anyone feel free to take that one on.
I'm going to talk about public sector unions. I don't have a holistic view of public sector unions, but I have a partial one, which is that so I have been voting with my feet and working more on state and local stuff in governance in Connecticut. I taught a class in it this past semester, and people aren't necessarily talking publicly about it. But like collective bargaining agreements are a big deal that often limit government effectiveness. And that's not to say there are not huge upsides to public sector unions, but in New Haven, the uh, traffic cop who pulls a gun on the job is fired, is unfired pursuant to collective bargaining. Um, the IT manager in the schools, these are in the news, who on whose watch $6 million are stolen. She then is not truthful about what she does to fix it. She's fired. She's unfired, subject to collective bargaining agreements. So my sense is that there are lots of things that are part of collective bargaining agreements that make it hard to fire bad workers. Sometimes they can make it hard to hire good workers. In Connecticut, I think this is in the federal government as well, uh, if there's an existing government employee who meets the minimum qualifications of a job, you have to hire that worker, even if there's someone much better on the outside. They can also kind of make it harder. We can have a more rigid pay scale. It's harder to reward good work and retain good workers. But like unions are really important, and like I'm very pro-union. The bargain that I want to see is you pay workers more and have fewer requirements, fewer workplace rules on hiring and firing and promotion, and that kind of have the grand bargain that makes union workers better off and makes the public better off. And I don't have solid empirical evidence. I don't know how widespread these things are, but at minimum, maybe you could get rid of some of the horror stories that lots of people in government talk about that are the result of collective bargaining.
We are pro-union, and the public sector unions are a core part of democratic governance, both to protect the rights of and dignity of civil servants, but also to help ensure that the closest to the work have a voice in how it's done. At the same time, we know that we are in a moment of transformation, and that civil service unions have been civil servants and federal sector unions have been politicized, demoralized, systematically hollowed out, all the things. And they are ready to rethink what their role is in the system. And we are in active conversations with our union, with our federal union partners, and hearing from them that they're ready to have more serious conversations about what reform looks like overall and what their role is in governing and in the reform agenda. Because the sense that we have is that like all the bad things that we were always trying to be like, no, like let's not open up Title V. Let's not address that because like then it's going to open the floodgates. Well, the floodgates have been opened. And so I think there is generally a sense of like we're ready to pull up a chair for real this time to the table to re-examine the role of federal unions and to make sure that everyone is being a good partner in the future of what like true governance looks like.
Yeah, just to add to that, I love that, and I think this the central moral value, right, of one, balancing power for workers, and two, sort of having the people most impacted and expert in the work at that's like have a seat at the table in defining how the organization runs, right? That's the core value, whether it's public sector or private sector. I know the question didn't ask about private sector, but I think it's implicit in what all three of us are saying. It's just worth underscoring that, like, we are in an economy of escalating, kind of exponentially escalating disparities of economic power, and it is critical, it seems to me, to have much more robust legal support for workers in general to organize, whether in public or in private, in order to rebalance that power. And it's not a coincidence, right, that the same folks running roughshod over the rights of federal workers and public sector workers are also kind of right out of the gate work very hard to neutralize the NLRB and neutralize federal labor law, right? It's part of the same. So when I kind of say this is all part of a reactionary turn and not just a deregulatory one, that's part of what I mean, that there's a consistent view for folks in power now that is anti-worker, that is anti-democratic view of the economy. And I think we're in the weeds on this piece, which we should be, but just kind of like not lose sight of the broader principle that about a democratic economy requires worker power that is thoughtfully engaged in co-governance.
So our next question, and this again for all the panelists, any thoughts on how, and this is from Raphael, any thoughts on how academics may regain the trust of the public so that the voices of experts regain importance?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, though I think it's a complex question. I mean, I think part of it goes a little bit, this may be a little bit of a non-answer, but part of my instinct is like, well, who are you writing for and how are you writing, right? So like one mode is, you have expertise, you've done some work to uncover, what is happening in a sector, and then you're developing that in a kind of policy memo for future policymakers, right? What Zach and Kylie were getting at earlier. That's one mode of engagement, right? There's a different mode of engagement, which is how to kind of trying to elevate public discourse, inform a broader public about what is happening in your area of expertise. I think Equitable Growth does a lot of this. Scholar Strategy Network does a lot of this. I think there are folks who are trying really interesting things. For example, partnering with there's the white paper and then there's the op-ed, and people often overlook the importance of like very local outlets, right? So thinking about where are you speaking and what language are you speaking? This is also where I think kind of spending some time with the folks you're trying to reach as an audience and just as a human is really important, right? I think it's hard because it's scholarship is hard. You have to be deep in the work, but I think there is a real importance to spending time with whether it's kind of journalists, editors, or like kind of people in your actual community or policymakers, whoever your audience is, finding ways to spend time with them so that you have a better understanding of like how they are thinking about the questions you are thinking about, And otherwise, I think a lot of times it's ships passing in the night. The language that we use in scholarship is not the language that people are using to make sense of their world, whether they're policymakers or like folks in your neighborhood.
I'd say two things. First is be truthful, and the second is to a large extent, to the extent possible, stick to the facts, and to the extent not possible, beware of the broader normative views of the public, especially in ways that differ from those of the expert academic class. I think my view is that's a lot of failures along those two dimensions are part of what have delegitimized expertise. To give one example, there was an interview on NPR from a professor at Yale, where I teach, several years ago. It was on immigration. She claimed, as an expert on immigration, that deterrence does not work, that harsh immigration policies do not deter immigration. That is false. There are many, many papers showing that is not true. I believe that was a backward engineering of evidence to support that person's normative views that kinder immigration policies are good. I happen to support kinder immigration policies. We have to stick to the facts. And especially if you're saying things that don't pass the sniff test. Most people would think that deterrence, harsh immigration policies will reduce immigration, even if you haven't seen the evidence. So I think greater truth, greater tenderness to the much broader set of values that could differ from those who sit in ivory towers, I think will help rebuild trust.
I totally agree with both of you guys. I think it's about showing up and listening first, knowing who your audience is going to be. I also think in terms of like who the research is for, like making it as like just implementable, useful as possible is great. I agree with what Zach said, and also think that stories do matter. I think like to the extent that research that is truthful can then be illustrated with a story. We have seen over the last year that you don't need facts in order, like you need one story. And I'm like obviously being sarcastic, but like you need one story to point to like this is why we're making this dramatic policy change. And that is obviously not a good thing to do and not a good way to govern. And yet it is like working in ways. And so I think to the extent that fact can be tied to stories, I think it is a good thing for people to see how outcomes and policies can be illustrated in real life.
Yeah, maybe just one more thing to add. I know we're coming up on time, and this might be a slight pushback on some of what Zach said, though I agree with a lot of what is being said here, is that I think it's fair to say stick to the facts once many of the facts are contested, right? It'll turn on, method and so forth. We all know that. But also I think like in some ways, it's important also to be upfront about one's normative conclusions, right? And one's normative North Star in a way that doesn't sort of taint the scholarship, but actually helps make clearer the unique contribution that the scholarship is making. So for example, if you're measuring effectiveness, right? Effectiveness towards what end? That is going to change your measure of what is effective. And so being upfront a little bit about even just at the high level, like for me, effectiveness means these broad goals. Those are goals that maybe not everyone shares, but maybe a lot of people probably do. And on that measure of effectiveness, here's what an analysis shows. And then one implication of that might be that, well, even if it shows that certain things are effective by some goal that maybe we all think we like, that where I land is that the trade-offs are actually does not make for a just policy. So there's a lot more there. And so I think that's an art, not a science, but I do think like we can go awry when we fuse in problematic ways, sort of normative priors and scholarly rigor. I think that's true. But I think sometimes we also go awry when we try to separate in an overly artificial way one's normative North Star and one's ultimate normative conclusions in a way that then also like doesn't pass the smell test, right? And so that's maybe muddying the waters a little bit, but I do think there's a piece of that where us speaking to one another as co-citizens, members of the same community, where we are humans and have priors and have values, and we have rigor, and those two things can coexist.
I think that's great. And we at Equitable Growth also believe in policymaking being evidence-based, and that in order to bridge researchers and policymakers, we also need to meet people where they are, and that's where how we talk about the evidence really matters. As Sabeel mentioned, we are running up against the clock, so I'm going to close this out, hopefully on a forward-looking note. And this is a question to all panelists. Please keep it to 30 seconds if you can. There will be a day after this crisis, a new administration in power, and so we're committing to that hopeful, vision, no question. But the question for all of you is, what is the most important first step to actualizing any of the reform ideas we discussed, or to prepare for that next governing moment? And I'll start with Kylie, and then Zach, and then Sabeel.
This will probably be an unsurprising answer given everything that I've said so far, but our theory of change is really centered around listening and people. So, like for us, the first step is listening to the civil servants and to the American people about what they need from their government, how we can be rebuilding trust and rebuilding a government that can actually deliver and earn people's trust back, that government can deliver for them, and that government and democracy are worth reimagining and rebuilding.
Yeah, I'd say two things. One is I focus on implementation. I think too much focus is on kind of high-level policy design, whereas what happens on the ground is really, really important. May not be as sexy, may involve a lot of learning about weeds, but I think that's what we need to do in order to remake government and make it effective. And like I said, I've been voting with my feet on this one in Connecticut. And second, I'd be willing to reconsider sacred cows. So some people are really wedded to certain forms of litigation. I think you really need to kind of introspect, ask yourself the real nature of the costs and benefits of those things. And there might be some costs to change, but maybe the benefits are much, much larger. So implementation on the ground, one, and two, reconsider sacred cows.
Yeah, I love all of that. And I'm kind of like amazed that we managed to not get into the weeds of administrative law on this call on the implementation front. I think what I'll just add to that is taking a blue sky orientation. And by that, what I mean is we should be explicit and upfront about the kind of democracy we all want to live in, one in which one that treats all of us as fair and equal humans, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, geography, religion, what have you. And so much of what is happening now is premised on the opposite of that notion. So we should embrace fully a normative notion of democracy that we're trying to create. And with that as our North Star, think, what is blue sky? What is fit for purpose to get us there in this moment? And I think that echoes a lot of what we're hearing from all three of us on the panel.
Excellent. So taking that blue sky energy, don't hop off just yet, everyone who is in attendance. There's a quick pop-up survey that will let us know if you want to get more involved, learn about any of the efforts or groups mentioned, and that will help us match you to the right efforts. And I also want to offer some well-deserved thank yous. So thank you, Sabeel, for your wonderful presentation, and to you, Zach and Kylie, for sharing your expertise and joining us. Also, big thank you to my colleagues, Corinne, Chantil, Shayna, and others at Equitable Growth for making this event a reality. Obviously, could not have done this without you. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them. And finally, thank you to all our attendees for joining. We look forward to continuing this work with you all, and let's keep the faith. Thanks, everybody.